Hi, my name is Steve Copeland. In trials involving eyewitness accounts, the credibility of the eyewitness or witnesses is paramount in rendering a judgment. The prosecutor will try to discredit and the defense attorney to determine that the witnesses are reliable. In this video, I'm going to outline the case for the eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I ask you to examine the case as if you were a member of a jury, and if you wish, to offer contrary evidence via comments. Firstly, some background. We have four Gospels which record the resurrection, and the Apostle Paul's account in his letter to the Corinthian church, which is also relevant. Firstly, what kind of men were the Gospel writers, and what was their mindset? We know that two were fishermen, and one was a former tax collector. Now, these men were brought up under the Mosaic law, which is summarized in the Ten Commandments. The ninth commandment states that no one should bear false witness, and this was considered to be a very serious crime against God and man. For example, Exodus 23:1 warns, "Do not spread a false report, do not help a guilty person by being a malicious witness." And Proverbs 19:9, "A false witness will not go unpunished." Now, considering the fact that they were very honest in admitting their mistakes and failures in the Gospels, we have no evidence to suggest that they did not take this commandment seriously. Now, secondly, they were expecting a Messiah who would liberate them. Since the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BC, Israel and its capital Jerusalem were controlled by pagans, and at this time by the Romans. Daniel had prophesied when the Messiah would be born, and Jewish scholars estimated that time to be around about 3 to 4 BC by our calendar. Now, the Jews believed the Messiah would be a conquering king like David. He would establish his throne in Jerusalem and throughout the world. The idea that their Messiah could be killed as a criminal was absolutely incredulous to the Jewish mindset, and we see this mindset whenever Jesus referred to his death in the Gospels, even though many of the prophecies confirmed this. These prophecies were simply ignored by Israel's leaders and teachers of the time, and still are today. Now, there were also Messianic pretenders at this time. These men gathered a following. They refused to pay Roman taxes. Some of the names were Thaddeus and Judas Galileus, who lived and died violently just a few kilometers from where the Gospel writers lived, as is recorded in Acts 5:34 to 39. So the mindset was, if such people were killed, they were obviously not the true Messiah, and they should simply wait for the right one, the one they called the Anointed One. So point number 2, when were the Gospels written down? Firstly, all of the 3 Gospels record Jesus' specific prophecies about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. This is Mark 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Now, that event happened under the command of Titus in 70 AD, and it's one of the most violent and significant events in all of Jewish history. Now, none of the Gospels records this horrific event, including John, so it is safe to assume that they were all written prior to AD 70. However, it is also clear that they were not written after the resurrection, as the disciples, including Paul in 1 Corinthians 7:29, believed that Christ would return within their lifetimes. So what was the purpose to write anything at all, to leave a record? In Luke 21, we have a summary of Jesus prophesying about the destruction of Jerusalem, but also the signs of his return at the end of the age. And he stated that this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. Now, a close examination of Jesus' words offers 2 possibilities. Either he was referring to the destruction of the temple, or the generation who will be born and still alive when Israel finally takes control of the city of Jerusalem. That event happened in 1967, which is 2,500 years after they lost control of the city in the 6th century BC. Now, a person born in 1967 could live to 2037 or even 2047, so time will tell which of these was the correct interpretation. But let me state this. God has never revealed the exact date of the return of Christ, but has given specific signs for people to look for. So, the likely dates for the writing of the Gospels are around about 25 to 30 years after the resurrection. Point number 3. Do the Gospels and Paul's account in 1 Corinthians 15:3-8 contain discrepancies regarding the details of the resurrection. In the chart that you can see, I have outlined the main discrepancies which skeptics claim prove the Gospels contradict each other. So firstly, in line 1, all of the Gospels agree that the first witness was Mary Magdalene. She was the first witness to the resurrection. Regarding the number of women, Matthew says 2, Mark 3, Luke several, and John 1. Some scholars suggest that there were different groups of women, but there is no collaborating evidence to support this. Regarding the time of day the women went to the tomb, Matthew writes at dawn, Mark after sunrise, Luke early, and John while it was still dark. Again, if there were various groups, perhaps this could be reconciled. However, there is a lot of time between still dark and after sunrise, so this appears at least to be a contradiction. Regarding the number of angels, we have 1 or 2, and they are either inside the tomb or outside. Now perhaps the angels moved about, but there is still no consistency. As to the earthquake, Matthew is the only one who mentions it. Now it would appear that at least 3, if not all of the disciples, got some of the minor details wrong. Considering the fact that these accounts were written at least 20 to 30 years after the event, this is not surprising, if indeed true. The most important question to be asked brings us to point number 4. That is, did the disciples give honest and unprejudiced accounts of the resurrection according to their recollections? Now, the events occurred in this order, although some of the details are also conflicting. On Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene and several other women went to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body, as was the Jewish custom. When they arrived, they saw a large stone which sealed the tomb by Pilate's command, and the stone had been removed. They saw an angelic young man who told them to report to the disciples. They went and reported. The disciples did not believe them and said they were talking nonsense. Peter and John went to the tomb with Mary Magdalene, and after finding it empty, they left. After the two men left, Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene and told her to go and tell the disciples that he had risen. They refused to believe her. So, why did they not believe her? Well, firstly, 2 of the Gospels record that Mary Magdalene initially met Jesus about 2 years earlier, that she had been demon-possessed and probably a prostitute. Were the disciples prejudiced towards her? Were they incredulous that Jesus would appear to such a person rather than to them? A deeper investigation and understanding of the cultural prejudice of the time reveals some really important points. The Apostle Paul had the task of preaching the gospel to Greeks and Gentiles throughout Asia Minor. Now, in his first letter to the Corinthian church, written around about 52 to 53 AD, he writes an account of Jesus' resurrection. This is 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. There is one glaring omission in this account: women. Paul never mentions women to his Greek-speaking audience, and for good reason. At this time, as in much of human history until recently, a woman's testimony was considered unreliable and almost worthless. Our English word for testify comes from the Latin testes or testis, from which we take our English word for a man's reproductive organs, testicles. The connection is very simple. Without testes, you cannot testify. Even today, in some Muslim countries, one man's testimony is considered equivalent to 3 to 4 women, a similar cultural perspective as in Paul's time. Now, most of Paul's audience did not believe in the idea of a resurrection. If Paul had told them that the first witness to the resurrection was a woman, they would have laughed at him. If he had added that she had previously been possessed by 7 demons and most likely living as a prostitute, he would have been run out of town as a fool. Despite this cultural prejudice, the one detail that all of the Gospels agree on is that Mary Magdalene was the first witness of the resurrection of Christ. So here I want to make a few quick points. Number 1, if a group of dishonest first-century Jewish men who had no respect for the 9th commandment decided to concoct a false story about a false Messiah, they would not use a reformed prostitute as their primary eyewitness. Prior to his death, Jesus had raised Lazarus of Bethany from the dead before a crowd which included many Pharisees. some of who were secret disciples. If you want to invent a credible story for first century people, use one or two of Israel's leaders, Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus, not Mary Magdalene. In Paul's account, the most respected people are mentioned by name, including the Lord's brother Jesus, who was a public figure in Jerusalem. Paul's account is most likely the first account written at least 10 years before the Gospels, so why didn't the Gospel writers simply do what Paul did and leave out the most potentially embarrassing details altogether? The answer is clear. They wrote their accounts as accurately as they remembered them. They didn't try to make the story more credible for their readers. Neither Paul nor the Gospel writers invent anything. The Gospel writers simply write what they recall, and Paul chooses to leave out potentially embarrassing details. We can also state that they were honest about their cowardice and their unbelief through including their most embarrassing failures in the Gospel records. They admit that they all fled when Jesus was arrested. They admit that they were hiding from the Jewish leaders. They admit that they did not believe Mary Magdalene or the two men that Jesus appeared to on the road. And they tell us that Jesus appeared to them as a group of 11 and rebuked them for their unbelief. And point number 5, what could they possibly gain from inventing a lie? It is very obvious that the disciples knew or at least anticipated the consequences of declaring Jesus had resurrected from the dead. He had warned them about persecution. They had witnessed his horrific death at the hands of the Romans and no doubt recognized an implied threat and fate to any who aligned themselves with Christ. Now surely it would be more plausible for them to deny his resurrection after his appearances to them out of a basic instinct for self-preservation. And if a concocted lie, how long would all of them keep to the lie after James was beheaded and Stephen stoned to death? They were flogged, they were imprisoned, they were beaten, they were tortured, and they were murdered for their testimony, and not a single one of them recanted. And what about Paul, who was previously known as Saul? By his own testimony, he was one of the chief persecutors of Christians right from the outset. He was a Pharisee who was convinced that the true Messiah could never be convicted as a crucified criminal, and under the authority of the Jewish leaders, he and his temple guards hunted, caught, tortured, and murdered Christians. After a report that the gospel had spread to Damascus, he was given letters and authority to conduct his mission to wipe out what he considered a dangerous heretical sect. On the road, he and his companions were stopped by an incredibly bright light above them. Saul was thrown to the ground, and he heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" And the voice replied, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Now, are we to believe that Paul invented this story? That he simply had a change of heart? He claimed to have been struck blind for 3 days as the Lord showed him all that he was going to suffer for the gospel. He became the apostle to the Gentile nations, and he experienced incredible suffering throughout his mission, and was also martyred for his testimony of meeting and following the risen Christ. And point number 6. Around 200 years ago, the swoon theory was put forward to claim that Jesus never actually died on the cross, but was either simply unconscious or in a coma and revived while he was in the tomb. This was a desperate attempt to deny the resurrection and is flawed for at least 3 reasons. Firstly, the Apostle John testified that when the Roman soldier went to break Jesus' legs, he found Jesus was already dead. To test whether Jesus was dead, he pierced him with a spear, most likely up and under his ribs, rupturing the pericardial sac, and water and blood flowed from the wound. If he was not already dead, as the separation of blood and water indicated, then the spear would most likely have finished the job. Now, John wrote this to show that the prophecy that none of his bones would be broken will be fulfilled, and in his testimony, he ended up confirming Jesus' death on the cross. Number 2, the idea that a Roman soldier would neglect to ensure the crucified criminal was dead shows a total ignorance of Roman military discipline. To fail in such circumstances, especially under Pilate's orders, would bring very severe punishment and even death. Number 3, swoon theory cannot explain the Apostle Paul's encounter with Christ, or the millions who have had existential experience of Christ over the past 2,000 years. One other equally desperate theory suggests mass hallucination, that Jesus only appeared to appear. The idea that 4 different groups had the exact same hallucination over a period of 50 days would be just as miraculous as the resurrection itself. This theory is utterly groundless. And finally, there is Jesus' stepbrother James, a man who believed Jesus was performing miracles with demonic power and that Jesus had lost his mind. We see this in Mark's Gospel. This stepbrother of Christ only became a disciple after a personal appearance and was also martyred for his conviction. So I rest my case. Now I ask that you go through that evidence and decide as if you were in a jury whether it stands or whether it falls. As usual, if you want to write thoughtful comments which contradict what I'm saying here, I'd be very happy to engage with you. But if you just want to write some mocking, derogatory comment without even listening to the entire video, I'll either remove your comment or just ignore you. Thank you for watching and take care.